Well, I would say that there are many positive evolutions and developments, one of them being the fact that Romania, I would say, is clearly a democratic country, perhaps not the same as France or Germany or the US, but clearly Romania now is, and it should be deemed, a truly democratic country. Also, the fact that Romania now is an EU member state also shows and clearly is a recognition of the fact that it is more or less an industrialized country. It does have a business environment which more or less functions, as well as the other requisite institutions. At the same time, Romania now has, well, I would say, a rapidly developing middle class, even with the current crisis, meaning that you don't see so many differences anymore in the lives of the middle class versus those, I would say, the middle class from other EU countries and the US. And overall, I would say that Romania and Romanians have a different, well, mentality and situation in life as existed before 1989. Of course, I would say Romania still is in transition, but it's much closer to the, well, if we can say the end, that they were even 3 or 4 years ago. At least I've heard this comment quite often, but really it's the people who make the place or make the country. I would say, generally speaking, and I say this having lived in other countries in Europe, such as France and Hungary, Romanians are generally much more open and accepting of foreigners. And you really, I should say, it's quite easy to feel at home. And this is quite a positive, I would say, aspect of Romania. Not to mention, of course, the I would say the physical aspects, such as the various areas, and in terms of, well, the tourism potential. The country does have quite a lot to offer, but again, also the opportunities in terms of a transition country, and the possibilities to actually do business and do things which in other EU countries or the US, I would say, you can no longer do as well, let's say, as efficiently and as easily. Again, having lived in other countries, for example, which were not, at least English was not the main language, Romanians have learned to speak English quite well, which means that nowadays, English being the most common, let's say, language, or at least I believe it is the most common language spoken, it's very easy to communicate with Romanians. Also, at the same time, the way Romanians conduct themselves, again, it's especially outside the office, they're quite friendly people, and quite, for example, they love events, weddings, birthdays. They tend to carry on all night. So this aspect of Romania is quite interesting, and it's one of my favorite things, let's say. But also at the same time, again, the fact that Romania is evolving, and you can see changes physically. You can see, let's say, the city being built up, but at the same time, you see people who 5 years ago were just starting out in a company, and now they're, well, more or less on the way to, to a successful, let's say, financial future. I would recommend to anyone is, obviously, every country or every, let's say, people are different. And Romania, I would say, is interesting from the point of view that it is something still a relatively new country in terms of, let's say, still it has not been visited by as many people as, for example, France or the U.S. or other, Japan, other countries. So, in other words, it's something new, but something new in the positive sense. Romania is really a European country. Again, there are differences when you compare, for example, France or Italy and Romania, but when you look at what let's say, what the European mentality is, what European culture is, clearly Romania does make part of that group. Romania, I would say, still has relatively few areas, unfortunately. But at the same time, there have been, for example, in the IT industry, being a lawyer, we actually have participated in transactions which For example, a foreign investor acquired a Romanian company or invested in a Romanian company, and this particular product is being sold all over the world. I would say in terms of services and in terms of also professionals, for example, Romanian managers going to also work abroad, especially in the countries which are, let's say, the non-traditional EU countries. In other words, a flexible workforce and rather capable and somewhat, or to a certain extent, quite educated. But again, I would say Romania at present, we can speak more about the potential than the actual, let's say, than the actual situation. But clearly, Romania does have, and Romanians do have quite a bit to offer. Part of the time I spent abroad, this was beginning in 1979, so during the 1980s, not so much for the obvious reason. But again, once the changes took place, due to the fact that I do have, and I did have family, it was always an interesting place, and it was always something, as part of my childhood. So more or less, for me at least, it was quite interesting to to go back and to see, again, the country evolve. I would come back every 2 or 3 years, and each time the differences were quite significant, and also in a positive manner. So it was always, in the back of my mind, and every time I left, I always looked forward to the next time. And about 11 years ago, 12 years ago actually, I decided to come back to this part of the world, and more or less since then I've made Romania my home. It was a professional opportunity, and at the same time, for personal reasons, I wanted to again go back and see how things were in terms of get reacquainted with family I had not seen in, well, at least I had not lived with in quite a number of years, I think 12 or 13 years. But again, at the same time, there were certain professional opportunities. Since I'm a lawyer and I practice at the so-called international level, it's always, I would say, more interesting to practice in Europe because you have so many diverse countries and jurisdictions very close together, whereas in the States where it's more or less, it's all the same. So therefore, this presented me an opportunity to come back and work in Europe and, again, to work in so-called international law. Romania at times is frustrating because, for example, everyday driving, it's an adventure, which once you get used to it, it becomes, normal. And when you do leave, it's quite difficult to get used to it again. But again, I would say most of us that have come back and have stayed for quite a bit, we're flexible in the sense of knowing that things are not perfect and they're not like, for example, as they are in the States. But what's important is that Romania is moving forward, although sometimes quite slowly and at times taking a step or two back. But again, it's interesting, and I would miss it if I would be away, simply because I did come back to at least contribute as much as possible to the evolution, to the transition. So if I was not directly involved, I certainly would miss it. My professional life would not be as interesting. I probably would have remained in the States, Florida, where I grew up, or New York. Most likely I would be doing the same type of law, but again, it's more interesting to do it at the international level. So I probably would have gotten used to, again, you always choose your life, and I'm sure that more or less I would be, leading a somewhat interesting life, at least not boring, but I would say clearly it's not the same as, or would not be the same as my situation now. And also personally speaking, since I have come back, I have married a woman who's, let's say, Romanian, and we have a child. So that obviously that aspect has, or this aspect has allowed me to, to further get back into my, let's say, my Romanian, background. Whereas if I had remained in the States, probably I would not have married, and I would not have such close ties to Romania. So it would have been let's say, a break, probably with my, Romanian background.